Now we're going to take a closer look at 4 of the songs that are on the Help album and kind of dig in with some of the features that I passed over pretty quickly on the previous video. Let's start with the song Help. This is a John song. It's a Beatles contrasting verse-chorus song. And just to remind you, when I say Beatles contrasting verse-chorus, what I mean there is it's a contrasting verse-chorus song, which means there's different musical material for the verse than in the chorus. So the music is contrasting. But it's a Beatles contrasting verse-chorus because there are 2 versions of the chorus that you hear, the one that appears at the beginning of the song and the one that appears later throughout the tune. Every now and again in a couple of these songs, the original version, the chorus 1 version, will come back in the song, but mostly it's chorus 1 and chorus 2. So that's what makes it distinctively Beatles. Remember, the argument was that once they stumbled on it, I don't know if they stumbled onto it, maybe that's not giving them enough credit, but anyway, once they discovered the Beatles contrasting verse-chorus with the song She Loves You, they repeated it with Can't Buy Me Love, I'm a Loser, and now the song Help. Interestingly, songs written both by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So with Help, though, we see some of the kinds of things we saw earlier in Beatles music, although approached from a different angle. Remember me talking about If I Fell, and how I was saying that the introduction of If I Fell seems to be not sure about the 2 different keys that it starts in. Is it in the key of D flat or the key of D? It starts off like it's going to be in D flat and ends up, the song continues in the key of D. And I said, well, that's kind of indicative of the protagonist in the song who's stuck between 2 relationships, one that's ending and one that's beginning, and he can't really decide which of those he wants to go with, stick with the one that he's already in where he's being hurt, or go into a new one where he may be just out of the frying pan and into the fire, be hurt again. And so this ambiguity between the 2 relationships is like the ambiguity between the 2 keys. Again, I said at that point that it's not important that John Lennon would have thought about this in music theoretical kind of terms, or really understood exactly what he was doing, or did it sort of technically on purpose. What he did was follow his impulse for trying to find music that captured what he was trying to say in the lyrics and came up with this solution. So now, at the beginning of Help, we see exactly the same kind of thing happening here, and that is that the beginning of the tune, if you work it out on the piano or the guitar or play the chords, use a chord progression which is a kind of descending thirds progression. And the thing about descending third progressions is once they get rolling, they're like something rolling downhill. You can really stop almost anywhere along the way and head off into any other key. So for example, when classical composers are changing keys inside of classical works, oftentimes they'll use a string of descending thirds to take them from key to key. They'll get to from one key to another key, but the listener won't really notice that some big sort of jarring key change has occurred. Well, that's the progression John uses at the very beginning of Help. What key that song is going to end up being in, it really only occurs because of the place where it stops. When you actually do the analysis of it, it's very difficult taking the first 3 chords before it gets to the 4th chord to decide exactly what the key of the thing is going to be. It ends up it's in the key of A, but that's not really clear from the very beginning of it. So I would say this sense of the tonality a little bit getting away from it, you know, I don't quite understand where I am tonally, is a pretty good analog for what the lyrics are talking about. They're talking about a person who, and here's a real indication of a more sophisticated approach to life views, the kind of thing that starts to happen as you get sort of deeper into your 20s and not so much out of your teens and your early 20s. And that is you begin to realize that the kinds of things that you seem to be so confident of, the kinds of things you thought you understood, no longer seem as simple as they once were. In many ways, you're not so confident that you're as right as you were when you were younger. There's an old saying, often said among older people, if you want to know something, ask a teenager, they know everything. And that's really kind of an indication of a kind of a confidence you can have when you're young and you think, you know, you're on the rise and that kind of thing. But you get to a certain age and you realize it's more complicated than that. You're not sure you know, you're not sure you're right. You wonder whether people see you and they think you're a certain kind of person and you know you're not. And this kind of insecurity begins to creep in, and that's what Help talks about. And so when John says, when he says help, what he's really saying is, I think what he's really talking about is a kind of a loss of the kind of cockiness and the sense of knowing that that he's absolutely correct and maybe he's not right. And we'll see this coming back in his music a lot. Now, if you read the books, they'll say that the way that John talked about this is he dismissed this as, yeah, well, I was gaining a little weight. That was during my Fat Elvis period. But that's just John deflecting and not wanting to tell you, I think, what's really going on here. He was trying to say something about the way he was thinking, about the way his life was changing. Here he was at the top of the world, and he still wasn't sure he was in control of things. Having these chords kind of roll a little bit out of control at the beginning is a great kind of musical analog for what he's talking about in the lyrics. Some other interesting features here. Notice the really prominent strummed acoustic guitar. Here you can really sort of see the kind of emphasis on acoustic guitar. At this point, acoustic guitar says folk music, maybe country, but mostly folk, and we get a lot of it in this one. And the interesting background vocals that both anticipate and echo the lines that John is singing in the lead vocal. That's a very sort of interesting approach, I think, to background vocals, and shows the Beatles innovating where they could have come up with more sort of stock vocal solutions. They come up with a solution here that really is quite new in their repertory. Let's turn now to the second John Lennon song we'll talk about, and that's You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. This one, a contrasting verse-chorus form, not a Beatles contrasting verse-chorus, but a pretty straight contrasting verse-chorus form, you know, verse, verse, chorus, verse, verse, chorus, verse. This is pretty much what most contrasting verse-chorus tunes, this kind of thing, are going to do. So there's nothing really innovative about the form. The interesting thing is it's not an AABA, but rather a contrasting verse-chorus form. The lyrics deal with somebody having to hide away their love, and the usual understanding of this is that John Lennon was really addressing this to the situation of Brian Epstein, who was a gay man at a time when it was actually illegal to be gay in the UK. You know, if you were found involved in any kind of gay sexual activity, you could be thrown in jail and disgraced in the UK. But Brian Epstein was in fact a gay man, and so this is a little bit of John sort of reaching out in Brian's direction and sort of talking about what it must be like to have kind of love relationships that in some ways, if people found out about them, would shame you, and so you've got to hide them away. You can't let anybody know. Pretty much stay in the closet, this kind of thing. And so that kind of philosophical lyric dealing with a social topic is really sounding a lot more like Bob Dylan than She Loves You, Yeah, 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 or I Want to Hold Your Hand. Or even I'm a Loser, right, which is a kind of a self-pity kind of thing. Now, John Lennon's trying to move in the direction of saying something philosophical, and I think does a pretty good job. An interesting note about this tune, in addition, is the flutes in it were played by a guy by the name of John Scott, at the time thought of as Johnny Scott. He was a flute player who was big around the Abbey Road studios there where the Beatles recorded most of their material, and was also an arranger working with people like Cilla Black and that kind of thing. So they brought John Scott in, and he ended up playing two flutes, an alto and a tenor flute. So you're actually hearing two flutes overdubbed at the very end of that. And I made a big point before of saying how interesting it was that they were bringing in an outside musician to use things. And of course, this would happen again with Paul with For No One, where he brings in the French horn, Penny Lane with the piccolo trumpet, even bringing in Eric Clapton during the White Album to play on something. So this begins a kind of thing that we're going to continue to see as the Beatles expand their sound. Let's turn to some of the Paul McCartney songs now. I've Just Seen a Face is the first one that I'd like to talk about. Now you may wonder, well, that doesn't seem like a big Paul McCartney song, but I want to talk about that one to lay the groundwork for what I'm going to say later and create a kind of string of songs, because this is really a kind of a first song that on the face of it doesn't mean so much, but when you begin to put it together with some of the later songs that he did, it's a very early indicator of a tendency that we're going to see in Paul's, especially in Paul's lyric writing. Formally, again, it's a pretty traditional contrasting verse-chorus, not a Beatles verse-chorus, and interestingly enough, not an AABA form. There's an intro, a verse, a chorus, a verse, a chorus, a verse, a chorus, a verse, a chorus, and then two more choruses on the way out. Again, a pretty typical arrangement of a contrasting verse-chorus kind of song. We get a lot of acoustic guitar here. Again, the Dylan influence, and many, because of the beat on this one and the tempo, almost sounds a little bit more country than folk, but the upfront quality of the acoustic guitar, again, says folk, it says authenticity, it says earnestness, it says seriousness of purpose. The lyrics are what I want to draw your attention to, and I want you to draw your attention to the way in which Paul uses metaphors. Now, you're going to have to, with all of these, seek the lyrics out on the internet because I can't quote them to you. Or I'll have the Apple guys all over me. So I'm going to count on you to go look this stuff up. But the metaphors that he uses here, in the first verse, he uses a metaphor of vision. Talks about seeing a face. In the second verse, he uses another metaphor about music, having talked about having perhaps looked the other way. So the vision with seeing and looking, this kind of thing. But then when he gets to the next verse that he writes fresh, he talks about having never known something. And so you get a metaphor of vision, thought. Now that's not, the typical way of building up metaphors according to the many manuals you can buy on lyric writing, where they would say, well, if you're going to use a metaphor for vision, you might go with one of the other senses in the next verse, and one of the other senses again in the next verse to kind of build up a systematic approach to your metaphors that makes the whole thing sort of hang together better. We can see Paul beginning to play with these metaphors in this kind of way, but it's not yet as systematic as it will become. But in a later video this week, I'm going to talk about a song called I'm Looking Through You, which is on Rubber Soul. And there you'll see that this is starting to happen more. And eventually, we'll see it happening in his music quite a bit, with almost a tripartite kind of structure of building in threes across verses to kind of build things up and turn them into larger structures with more meaning. So here we see him sort of as on the first step that way. The last song I want to talk about in this video close-up is Yesterday, another Paul song. And here we have a real blend of conservative and more kind of progressive musical tendencies here. On the conservative side, this is an AABA form, a kind of Paul ballad, right? AABA with a partial reprise, so we've got AABA, and then a return of just the BA sections, and then a tag at the end. So from that point of view, it's fairly traditional. It's interesting that it's Paul all by himself with the acoustic guitar and chamber strings. George Martin tells the story that when Paul played the song for him, he said, I can't really hear loud guitars or drums on this, maybe strings. And Paul McCartney said, strings? I don't want any of that sort of sweet, syrupy pop kind of thing. Remember, just a couple years earlier, we were talking about the softer pop that had been a part of the UK scene with lots of strings and a kind of softening of rock and roll. He said, no, George Martin said, well, not maybe a string section, maybe just chamber strings, a small group of strings to give it a kind of maybe a more interesting kind of an approach. And so that's exactly what they ended up doing. They considered releasing it as a Paul McCartney solo record, not as a Beatles record, because none of the other Beatles are actually on it. But they didn't. You can see that the lyrics themselves are more philosophical than Paul's other love songs when he talks about what yesterday means, and I think where it kind of breaks down is in the bridge, where he ends up giving a romantic explanation for what mostly seems like a kind of a philosophical reflection during the verse sections. But nevertheless, we can really see Paul starting to take this philosophical lyrics thing much more seriously. Now, on the next album, Rubber Soul, we'll talk about it this week, his next installment on this path is a song called Michelle, which keeps a lot of the same features of Yesterday, but I think ends up not ending up being the direction he's going to go with this. But on subsequent albums, we hear songs like Eleanor Rigby, which really sort of comes back to what Yesterday is doing here, and She's Leaving Home, which adds the harp to the strings, again, sort of coming back to the same kind of thing. And really, ultimately, something like The Long and Winding Road, although you must say Paul McCartney was not happy with the strings that Phil Spector added on that, but that's a story for another day. Anyway, so it's Yesterday sets the stage for things that are to come. So in the next video, let's take a closer look at the album that follows Help, Rubber Soul.